Hey, what's going on? I'm Wildcard MTG, and welcome to this EDH deck tech for Eluge, the Shoreless Sea. Eluge is a 1 generic 3 blue mana legendary creature, elemental fish, which says, Eluge's power and toughness are each equal to the number of islands you control. Whenever Eluge enters or attacks, put a flood counter on target land. It is an island in addition to its other types for as long as it has a flood counter on it. The first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs 1 generic or 1 blue less to cast for each land you control with a flood counter on it. So, with that knowledge of what Eluge does, let's break down the rules text on Eluge so we have a better understanding of how the card works. In this rules text, information is taken from Scryfall, and first up here we have the ability that defines Eluge's power and toughness functions in all zones, not just the battlefield. So that means if it goes to the graveyard, it's going to have the same power and toughness. Next up, we have a land affected by Eluge's second ability stays an island until the flood counter is removed, even if Eluge leaves the battlefield. And it also says that the land retains any land types and abilities it already had. An island has the ability to tap, add blue. So for instance, if you were to put a flood counter on your Temple of the False God or Emergence Zone, the land will functionally still do the same thing, but it will also have the ability of tapping it to add blue. The next one up here is if the first instant or sorcery spell you cast in a turn doesn't cost any blue, its cost will be reduced by 1 for each land you control with a flood counter. 1 generic, that's it. And the next one up here, in the case where the first instant or sorcery spell you cast in a turn does cost some blue, but you control more lands with flood counters on them than the number of blue in that spell's mana cost, all of the blue in the cost are reduced first before moving on to the generic mana. For example, if you control 4 lands with flood counters on them and you cast Season of Weaving, which is a sorcery with a mana cost of 4 generic and 2 blue, as the first instant or sorcery spell in your turn, its cost will be reduced by 2 generic and 2 blue, meaning its total cost will be 2 generic. And finally, the last thing here says, to determine the total cost of a spell, start with the mana cost or alternative cost you're paying, such as flashback cost. Add any cost increases, such as kicker costs, then apply any cost reductions, such as that of this ability. The mana value of the spell is determined by only its mana cost, no matter what the total cost to cast the spell was. So getting into this commander in this deck itself, the way that I've seen a lot of people build this so far is a lot of extra turns and theft spells, which, as we know at most casual tables, is an absolutely miserable experience. So I'm trying to go outside of the box for this build, and this deck itself is even semi-budget. Comes in at about $90 at the time of this recording. But near the end, I'll have some suggestions for some upgrades for different things we could do with the deck. Now, this list goes for a more control, flicker, clone approach, with a couple of little cheeky spells in there that technically give an extra turn if played at the right moment, without it actually being an extra turn. In fact, they're the turn spells. And I just want to clarify too, when I say control, I don't mean counter spells galore. I mean things that kind of give us options to control players' attack phases, creatures, or turns, and this is stuff we'll break down in each section as we go. So with that, let's break down the aspects of the deck and its curve. So for this deck specifically, we're running 20 creatures, 1 battle, 18 sorceries, 17 instants, 5 artifacts, 2 enchantments, and 36 lands. We have a pretty even ratio of instants and sorceries. We want a lot more of them than anything in this deck because that's what Eluge is built around, instants and sorceries. And we also want to be playing stuff on other people's turns, so we'll have cards that'll deal with that as well. So, our average mana value of the main deck is 2.58 with lands and 4.05 without lands. The median mana value of the deck is 2 with lands and 4 without lands. And the deck's total mana value is 255. Let's get into our 1-drops here. Alright, so let's take a look at our 1-drops here real quick. We only have 6 of them. 3 are sorceries, 2 are instants, 1's an artifact. 1 is technically an X spell, and we are going to want to dump more mana into it, but we'll get to that later. We have a 97.74% chance of playing these on curve. Now, realistically, we're not going to play any of these on curve because some of them are exile, flicker spells, once ramp, wafers, bauble, and other kind of mana doublers like High Tide, Piracy Charm, so that way we can make all things. If somebody has an island, we can get in for unblockable, things like that. So now looking at our 2-drops, we have 4 creatures, 1 sorcery, 2 instants, and 2 artifacts. A lot of these creatures we can easily play on curve. We'll get into each one as we go through those sections, but here's what they look like on the screen. And next up here is our 3-drops with 5 creatures coming in for 3, 3 sorceries at 3, 3 instants at 3, 1 artifact at 3, and 1 enchantment at 3. We have a 78.5% chance of playing these on curve. Obviously with the instants and sorceries, that will change depending on whether or not we have Eluge out, because they will be cost reduced. So that will help our curve. And for our next 4-drops here, we have 9 creatures, 2 sorceries, 2 instants, and 1 artifact. So a lot more creatures in the 4 mana range. A lot of these help with playing sorceries at instant speed, copying spells. Some of them even control people's like battle and attack phases. We can goad creatures, all that kind of stuff. Really interesting creature package we got here, but we'll get to that in a minute. Other than that, it says we have a 62.9% chance of playing these on curve. Again, the instants and sorceries are going to be cost reduced, so I would not worry too much about those. And for our 5-drops, we have a battle, which we'll talk about in a minute. 2 creatures, 1 sorcery, 1 instant, and 1 enchantment. Again, cost reduction for the instants and sorceries through Eluge. We don't have to worry about that too much. This Sorcery Lorien Revealed is also a cycling card for island cycling, so if we don't want to use it for card draw, we can use it to just get an island instead. And our 6-drops, we have 1 creature, 4 sorceries, and 5 instants. This is where the bulk of our crazy spells are really going to come from, the cool stuff that we want to kind of do, like Time Stop and Discontinuity. We'll get to those in a minute. Now this says we have a 31.12% chance of playing these on curve. Again, if we have Eluge out, it's not going to matter. These will be cost reduced so hard. We will be able to play them on other people's turns if we have the right cards out, the right package set up. The curve on this is really only referring to the creature, which is the Torrential Gear Hulk, which will let us recast something from our library when needed, which is really cool to have. And these last 2, one's a sorcery for a 7-drop. We have Hunted by the Family. We have a 19.77 chance of playing this on curve, but again, probably won't matter because it'll be cost reduced. And then rounding it out for 8 drops here, 1 sorcery and 1 instant. We have Amanatu's Augury and Dig Through Time, which are both 8 mana. It says we have 11.77 chance of playing those on curve, but again, they'll be so cost reduced that it won't matter. And then finally, our 9-drops. Yeah, that's right, we got some 9-drops. 3 sorceries that are 9-drops. We have a 6.58% chance of playing these on curve. Like I've said a million times already, these are going to be cost reduced through Eluge, through other things on like Mind Splice Apparatus. All kinds of creatures that we have that cost reduce these things. They will not cost 9 mana. These are sort of win cons, I guess, with like Mnemonic Deluge and Clone Legion, but we'll get to those in the breakdown, and that is everything in the deck and the mana curve. Alright, so let's get into each section of the deck here. We're going to start it off with a battle and the creatures. So we have 1 battle in this deck, and that is Invasion of Arcavios. Now, I was a little hesitant to put it in here, but it makes sense when you kind of see it. So it says when Invasion of Arcavios enters battlefield, search your library, graveyard, and or outside the game for an instant or sorcery card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So let's just tutor an instant or sorcery. Great. It's got 7 damage or counters on it that we have to get rid of. Now, if we get rid of it, it's an enchantment that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand, you may copy those spells. It's a good way to get that copy spell thing out that I was talking about earlier. You know, obviously getting this thing down with 7 is going to take a little bit of time, but we have ways to do that by removing counters off things. Should be able to move a counter off of the battle onto Goldberry. I could be mistaken about the interaction, but I will double check the rules on that. So yeah, after looking up the rules, it seems like Goldberry can take those defense counters off of the battle, so we don't even have to attack it, and then we just move the defense counters to something else. They have no intrinsic value on anything else, so it really won't matter what we put them on, but it's a good way to get them off of there. Is it slow? Yes, but it's another way to like get the counters off there if we are not able to attack it. So that's our battle. Going forward, we have 20 creatures that are in the deck, and they are the following creatures. We have Archmage's Newt, Avon Courier, Cosima, God of the Voyage, Defiler of Dreams, Dulcet Sirens, Eon Frolicker, Fate Spinner, Galvanic Giant / Storm Reading, Gandalf, Friend of the Shire, God Eternal Kefnet, Goldberry River Daughter, Guardian of Tazim, Howdy Jin, Hercule Master Wizard, Maeve Insidious Singer, Meneldur Swift Savior, Mercurial Spelldancer, Osier Pakpatik, Deepest Epoch, Torrential Gearhulk, and Final Word Phantom. So with our creatures, they focus a lot on keeping the board locked down a little bit by not letting creatures attack or to goad them. You know, with such cards like Guardian of Tazim, Galvanic Giant, Maeve Insidious Singer, Dulcet Sirens, and Eon Frolicker. They do different things that kind of let you control a player's board state, you know. Guardian of Tazim, you know, basically is landfall. Yes, it's 5 mana, but when a land enters the battlefield, we can tap a creature target opponent controls, and if it's a land, that creature doesn't even untap the next end step. Dulcet Sirens, we can control a target creature to attack another opponent, which is a big deal. If we don't want somebody's big 12/12 coming at us, we can make the Siren attack it to another player, which is really good. And of course, Maeve, Insidious Singer, a 3 mana go target creature. Whenever that creature attacks, draw a card. And you can do that as many times as you want, as long as you have the mana. If you want to take a turn off and go to a bunch of creatures, it's perfect for kind of controlling those battle outcomes. Now, Eon Frolicker is a little different, but it's a pretty cool card. I mean, for 4 mana, when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you let an opponent take an extra turn. Your next turn, you and planeswalkers you control gain protection from that player. So obviously this player could take their extra turn and choose not to attack the other players, but they're probably going to do that, especially if you're targeting the player who is the most aggressive player at the table. You're going to want to target them to clear out the other people for you. Worry about them later, most likely. So there's some cool ways to kind of like really lock down the board like that. Another one that you can really use to your advantage is Fate Spinner. This card is a little on the mean side, I guess, but you know, we talked about that control aspect of the deck, and this really lets you control a player's turn. So it says at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player chooses draw step, main phase, or combat phase. The player skips each instance of the chosen step or phase in the turn. So if they say combat phase, it means they're not getting a combat. If they say main phase, that means they can't cast any spells. Draw step, I doubt anybody's ever going to skip their draw step. So that one's a little bit tougher, and the player gets to choose which one, but it is a little, you know, they have to make that choice. So it's a little control-y in that aspect, and I really like it for this deck. Now, there's also creatures that reduce or give us extra casts from our instance sorceries, obviously like Haughty Djinn, Archmage's Newt, Osier Pakpatik, and God Eternal Kefnet. Now, with those, Osier Pakpatik is probably the coolest one. You know, it says whenever you cast an instant spell from your hand, it gains rebound. And so basically that means at the beginning of your next upkeep, you will get to cast that spell again. Now it's only instants, and you have to cast it from your hand, so if you're doing a copy or you're copying it from the graveyard, it will not see that, but still, pretty cool. So say you were to flash in something on somebody's end step, you cast that, and now it's going to come to your turn, and on your upkeep, you're going to get to cast that again, which is a really neat way of like keeping that control of the board and, you know, everything kind of going on there. We have God Eternal Kefnet here, which lets you reveal the first card you draw, and it's a May, you don't have to do it, but whenever you do, and it's an instant or sorcery, you can copy it, and you can cast it, and the copy costs 2 less to cast. Now, it's a good way of doubling up on your spells. You don't always have to do it. Again, like I mentioned, Haughty Djinn, instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, so it's another bit of reduction that doubles up with Eluge. Now, you'll have to stack them whichever way first. Obviously, you want to do all your other, if you have multiples out of the reductions, and then put Eluge's reduction onto that to make the spell cost less. Our 2 main creatures that we really want to have out for some of our other synergies to work are Gandalf, Friend of the Shire, Final Word Phantom, and Fate Spinner, like I mentioned earlier, to really control a player's turn. Now, Gandalf lets us cast a lot of our sorceries at flash speed, and that's really, really helpful for some of these sorceries. And Final Word Phantom, during each opponent's end step, you can cast spells as though they had flash. So if you have some sorcery that you were hoping to play on somebody's end step, it's a great way to do that. And it's at each opponent's end step, so you can wait, you know, until the person before you and get them with something, you know, that they may not see coming, you know, get them hunted by the family or something like that. Yeah, there's little interesting things you can do with that kind of like end step casting thing. You're going to be playing a lot of control and really not even playing much on your turn if you can, unless you're trying to just get flood counters and stuff like that. So there's a lot of really interesting synergies with these creatures and our spells that we're going to be trying to cast. Now, let's get into the sorceries real quick here. Now, I'm sure you're looking at a lot of these. They have high mana costs and thinking it's probably too much and we should run more instants. But like I mentioned in the beginning, you know, with Eluge out and putting flood counters on our lands, we'll get to cast them for less. We have so many cost reduction things in the deck. And on top of that, if we have Gandalf or any of our other play sorceries at flash speed enablers on the battlefield, having this many just really won't be a problem for the things we want to pull off. So in this deck, we're running 18 sorceries, and they are Aminatu's Augury, Aquitect's Will, Arcane Heist, Clone Legion, Cosmic Epiphany, Denying Wind, Fade Away, Finale of Revelation, Flow of Ideas, Hunted by the Family, Glorian Revealed, Mitotic Manipulation, Mnemonic Deluge, Portent of Calamity, Raven Form, Rise from the Tides, Spell Twine, and Splash Portal. Now, obviously, Aquitect's Will lets us add flood counters to lands, so if we are able to double up that spell, that would be great, because you can put multiple flood counters on lands. Even if you have to put an extra flood counter on a land, you can just move it around with Goldberry, so it's not that big of a deal to have extra flood counters on lands for later on. Now, we do have quite a bit of card draw spells, you know, like Finale of Revelation, Flow of Ideas, Lorien Revealed. Cards like Fade Away and Denying Wind also really play into that control aspect of the deck. And if you're able to copy either one of these and choose new targets, or just double up that effect on one player, it can be really devastating for any opponent. Now, Fade Away, it says, for each creature, that creature's controller pays 1 or sacrifices a permanent. So if you're able to flash this in at the end of somebody's turn when they're all tapped out, well, it looks like they're going to have to start sacrificing permanents, and it's not going to be good for them. You could board wipe them for 3 mana almost if they don't have the mana for it. And again, if you're able to copy this spell and then put it on another player, you can board wipe 2 people at once. Now, the really dirty one, it's a card I feel is really funny, especially if you're able to copy it, and it is very high mana cost. It's 9 mana. But again, with the cost reduction, it won't be that much when you're playing it. But it says, search target player's library for up to 7 cards and remove them from the game. Then that player shuffles his or her library. So you're really taking out all of their win cons are good cards. So imagine copying this card and getting rid of 14 cards from their deck. I mean, it's just crazy. And they're exiled. They're not even put in the graveyard. They're just straight up exiled. Really cool sorcery. It's like 50 cents. I mean, you know, if, like I said, with the cost reduction on this thing, if you're able to cast this and copy it, you can really hinder everybody's decks pretty hard. And it plays into that control aspect that we talked about. We're not, like I said, we're not using counter spells and stuff like that. We're really forcing people to play their decks in the way that they, well, don't want to play them, really, or taking away the tools they need to play those decks, controlling that aspect of their deck play. I'm not a big control player, but it's more of a control thing that I enjoy rather than just counterspelling everything. Now, Mnemonic Deluge and Aminatu's Augury are ways to play instant sorceries from our graveyard or the top of our decks, getting a bunch of free spells. Tried and true win cons. I mean, these things have been around forever. They're pretty budget nowadays, which is good. Now, one card I really want to point out here specifically in this deck is Portent of Calamity. It's a new card from Bloomburrow that I'm like pretty high on right now, and it lets you dump a lot or as little mana into it as you need in order to really dig through the top X cards of your deck. So if you put at least 4 into the spell, you can play it for free, and it lets you put all the cards exiled during the casting of the spell, and you just put them in your hand. So it's like pseudo card draw. You get 3 cards and you get to cast one for free. Now, I know it's a sorcery, sorcery speed, whatever, but again, we have all these little flash enablers. So you could even flash this in. And so Portent Calamity says, reveal the top X cards of your library. For each card type, you may exile a card of that type from among them. Put the rest into your graveyard. You may cast a spell from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. If you exiled 4 or more cards this way, then put the rest of the exiled cards into your hand. Now, obviously, lands are going to get put into your graveyard, unfortunately, if you kind of whiff on some of this stuff, but that's why you want the cost reduction. So you can maybe go higher than 4, you know, maybe get 6, dig 7, you know, however much mana you want to dump into this thing. And that's why I think this card's kind of good. I mean, it's only like 50 cents. It just came out. It seems like a really good way to dig to get like that pseudo card draw, and you get to play something for free. It's crazy to me. So I hope people really catch on to this card. I'm onto it. I think it's a good card. Being sorcery kind of sucks, but I think with the way this deck is built, it's not going to be as bad as people would make it out to be. And even then, in a regular deck, I still think sorcery speed, digging, and like getting to cast something for free for about 4 or 5 mana is pretty darn good. So definitely keep your eye on that card, check that card out, start slotting it into decks. Let me know what you think about that card, because I think it looks pretty good. I mean, especially the card is pretty incredible for what it does, I think. Now, we also play some clone effects in the deck, like Clone Legion and Hunted by the Family, because why play our creatures when we can just copy everyone else's? See, we don't need creatures. If we're playing against a deck that's like very aggro and has a ton of creatures, well, let's just copy them all, and then we have our own. So it's a good way to kind of like help in combat too, because then you can just block with their creature and trade. Now, another weird card in this deck is Mitotic Manipulation, and it's like a way to kind of pseudo-ramp, so to speak. You know, you can dig 7 cards deep, and if you find an island, you can put it on the battlefield. And if you're able to copy that spell, then you can get 2 lands out of it. So basically what this card says is, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may put one of those cards onto the battlefield if it has the same name as a permanent. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So if we have a permanent that is an island that's already on the battlefield, boom, we can get another island. Obviously, I don't think a lot of people are going to be copying a lot of our permanents. You know, maybe we'll get lucky and somebody has a Swiftfoot Boots or a Thought Vessel or a Wayfarer's Bauble, but who knows? Really, it's just a way to kind of like ramp in a way, I think. Feel free to take this card out, but I think it's pretty cool. And like I said, if you're able to copy it, it'll do its job. I think it's an interesting card, especially for a budget deck like this. So that's all the sorceries in this deck. Let's move on to the instants. Now, a lot of the instants in the deck are kind of divided between blink and flicker spells and really odd ways of taking extra turns by, well, ending the turn. And so we're running 17 instants in this deck, and they are Born Upon the Wind, Complete the Circuit, Dig Through Time, Discontinuity, Elminster's Simulacrum, Engulf the Shore, Fated Infatuation, Gale's Redirection, Ghostly Flicker, High Tide, Illusionist Gambit, Mirror Match, Piracy Charm, Planar Incision, Second Sight, Teferi's Time Twist, and Time Stop. Now, all of our flicker spells are really used in this deck to get more flood counters on our lands, to make Eluge bigger, and to get a higher cost reduction for those spells. So cards like Teferi's Time Twist, Ghostly Flicker, and Planar Incision let you do that, and you can even use those spells to kind of save Eluge from like removal or board wipes or whatever you may need to do to keep him on the board. The other interesting thing too is that, at least with two of them, he would enter into the battlefield with an extra +1/+1 counter on him, which would make him a little bit bigger. Now, it doesn't help with like the lands or the flood counters, but still, making Eluge bigger so maybe you can swing in and attack and get a flood counter on something, that helps too. Now, we also have cards like Illusionist Gambit and Mirror Match to, again, copy our opponent's creatures in the event of a more aggro or creature-heavy decks. Now, those cards are pretty interesting, especially Mirror Match. You know, it's 6 mana, but it's an instant. Now, again, if we're having this cost reduction and we're not having to play it on our turn, we will get to play this for that first. If it's the first spell on somebody else's turn, we'll get that reduction. And so it says we can only play Mirror Match during the Declare Blocker step, and for each creature attacking you or a Planeswalker you control, put a token that's a copy of that creature onto the battlefield, blocking that creature. So you're going to trade up with everything. You're going to probably wipe their board unless they have some kind of crazy, you know, heroic intervention or something like that to kind of stop it, or they counter this spell, you know, but it's a good way to kind of control that combat. And, you know, Illusionist Gambit, same thing. You can only cast it during the Declare Blocker step on an opponent's turn. Now, this one's a little different in that you're going to remove all attacking creatures from combat and untap them. And after this phase, they're an additional combat phase, and each of those creatures attacks that combat if able, but they cannot attack you or a Planeswalker. So now they are forced to make combat with another opponent, and they have to. So it's a good way to kind of like change that direction of a more aggro deck away from you. Again, it comes down to that control aspect of the deck. You know, we're not countering stuff, we're just kind of getting the other players off of us by putting them onto somebody else. Now, they're the two cards that I've been talking about that are kind of the linchpin of this deck, in a way. The fun way that I wanted to use these so-called extra turns, but they're not really extra turns, but they are Time Stop and Discontinuity. So Time Stop is 4 generic mana, 2 blue, it's an instant, and it just says, end the turn. And what that means is remove all spells and abilities on the stack from the game, including this card. The player whose turn it is discards down to his or her maximum hand size, damage wears off, end this turn, and until end of turn effects end. So, imagine somebody's going to attack you for lethal, or, I don't know, somebody's about to play a board wipe. Nope, Time Stop. Ends the turn. Takes everything off the stack. Not going to happen anymore. And not only that, it effectively ends that player's turn, and then it'll go to the next player's turn. But if you're playing this on like a weird way where, like, you know, somebody's like on their end step or about to start their turn, really, you want to play this after they're going to do their upkeep. And then their turn's done. They can't do anything else. So you effectively have taken away a turn from them, and now the turn's coming back around to you, so you get, quote-unquote, an extra turn, so to speak. Really, you're just denying turns to players, but it's not as egregious as how some people have built this deck with just endless extra turn spells. And it's that control-y aspect. You know, you're controlling that player's turn. You're taking it away from them. You're like, no, my turn. Doesn't matter. And we have 2 of those spells in here. So Time Stop is one that just says end the turn, and then we have Discontinuity, which is 3 generic and 3 blue. And it says, as long as it's your turn, this spell costs 2 generic and 2 blue less to cast. And it's the same thing as Time Stop. It just says end the turn. It's the same amount of mana, just has an extra blue pip. So again, this is something you can instant speed to effectively stop somebody's turn. Now we have, like I said, we have ways of getting this back. We can take some stuff from the graveyard and play it out of the graveyard if we need to, you know, flash it in and stop somebody else's turn again. You know, it's just a silly little way to like do something different with the deck. I thought they were really cool spells, and you know, I figured since everybody's building extra turns, well, let's just deny turns. How about that? So those are kind of the linchpins of the deck that I really wanted to build around, along with Eluge's, you know, discount on the mana costs and everything. You know, you're effectively playing an Uno skip card on them. You know, it's not quite an extra turn, but it definitely puts a player behind having their turn skipped entirely. And so that's kind of the way we're going to run this deck. Now, we have a really small artifact package in this deck. We're only running 5 artifacts. They are Mind Splice Apparatus, Quicksilver Fountain, Swiftfoot Boots, Thought Vessel, and Wayfarer's Bauble. Now, we all know Wayfarer's Bauble. It's for kind of ramping. Swiftfoot Boots is to protect Eluge or whatever creatures we may need that we want on the battlefield to copy spells or whatever. Mind Splice Apparatus helps cost reduce further, you know, compounding with Eluge's ability. And then Quicksilver Fountain is another linchpin in the deck because it adds flood counters to everything. Now, enchantments, again, are also very minimal because this is mainly a sort of spell slingery type deck. We only have 2 enchantments, and that's As Foretold and Virtue of Knowledge / Vantress Visions. Now, obviously, As Foretold helps us cast spells for free, and then Virtue of Knowledge and Vantress Visions allows us to copy Eluge's ETB ability, or have it get an extra Enters ability later on when we flinker or blink it or whatever we're able to do, depending on how soon we can get this out. So it's a little interesting way to double up on those flood counters if he enters. Now we're running 36 lands in this deck. They are Demolition Field, Emergence Zone, 27 Islands, Lonely Sandbar, Myriad Landscape, Mystic Sanctuary, Nesting Grounds, Temple of the False God, and Terrain Generator. Demolition Field is an underrated land. It's really good for taking out really problematic non-basics, you know, like if somebody's running a Vesuva or a Thespian Stage or an Urborg or a Cabal Coffers, Demolition Field's going to get rid of it. It's only 2 mana. I think people will really need to run these more with how much utility lands people run in their decks. Now, Myriad Landscape lets us sort of ramp, or, you know, we can put a flood counter on it if we need to, and that helps out with Eluge. Nesting Grounds this is another linchpin of the lands here. It lets us move flood counters around on the lands, kind of like Goldberry does. And if needed, we have Emergence Zone that lets us cast sorceries at flash speed. Again, this plays into the playing things on other people's turns part of the deck, you know, so we can get that Eluge trigger of casting something for less than it should. Now there are a few other utility lands like Terrain Generator just to kind of play an extra land. Mystic Sanctuary to get back an instant or sorcery if we want those discontinuities or time skips, we can get those back. And then Lonely Sandbar, just in case we need to cycle it for card draw in late game or just to have a flood counter added to it. Now, I know you heard me say Temple of the False God is in this list, and honestly, this is one of those lands I go back and forth on so much whether it's a good inclusion or not. I mean, for years, I took it out of every single deck I owned and would opt for like a basic or multicolored land over it, anything but Temple of the False God. But weirdly enough, over the past few months, I've really started slotting them back in my decks more, and the card has actually come in clutch more often than not. And it's kind of crazy how often, like, you know, you're on turn like 5 or 6 and you draw the Temple and you're like, oh cool, I have 2 extra mana now. This changes my whole turn. So for this deck specifically, I added it over Sol Ring. I know, that's some blasphemy. But you can destroy Sol Ring, you can't really destroy Temple of the False God unless somebody's, well, playing a Demolition Field. And also, like I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this show, you can put a flood counter on it and then, well, it can tap for blue mana. And now some pros and cons of the deck itself. Now, obviously, this is a budget deck, and there aren't really any outright win cons in here. But, you know, I think with the cost reduction, that's a big pro of this deck. We're going to be cost reducing so much stuff here. And, you know, having that cost reduction, being able to play these spells on other people's turns, that's really a big aspect of the control part of this deck, and that's the pro of everything. Now, the cons, obviously, if people keep removing Eluge, he's just going to get harder and harder to cast, and you're not really going to be able to get flood counters on anything. Having Eluge stick around is a big part of this deck, so if he's not around, you really can't do much, and that's a big con of the deck. And not only that, if he's not around, we're not going to get the cost reduction on these massive spells we have in the deck, at least from Eluge. We have a couple other ways to do that, obviously. So he's the big linchpin of the deck, obviously, so that's a big con right there in itself. If he doesn't stick around, the deck just kind of folds. So take that into account when playing. So, with that is the entire deck. You know, Eluge is a really interesting commander that can do things other than extra turns or theft. You know, I've even been kind of theory crafting a storm kind of list for this commander, but that's for another time, and if anyone has any interest in seeing that, well, just let me know and I will. And as I mentioned earlier, here are some cards that you can use to upgrade the deck. Feel free to take out whatever you feel doesn't need to be in this deck. Now, this plays more into the playing things at flash speed and reduction of the deck, you know, playing things on everybody's turns or having stuff not get countered. So what we would add to this deck is Lear, Disciple of the Drowned, Teferi, Mage of Zhalfir, Vidalcan Mastermind, which is a really interesting card. I even thought about adding it to the main deck because then you could kind of just put Eluge back in your hand, but then, you know, you're going to have to pay 4 mana for it again, and, you know, you're really screwing up your tempo if you have to do that too much, but I do think the card's interesting and it does have some legs. Wizards of Thay, Quicken, so that way, again, you can play sorceries as though they have flash. Vidalcan Orrery, obviously, so you could play flash, and then Leyline of Anticipation. Those are all the upgrades I would make to this deck if I wanted it to be a little less budget. There are some even stronger things we could put in this deck, but those are the ones that I thought kind of played more to what I would want to do with this deck personally. And so that's it. That's Eluge, one of the more interesting commanders to kind of come out of Bloomborough. I'm Wildcard MTG. Thank you so much for watching this deck tech, and we'll see you on the next one. If you have one you want me to build, let me know in the comments, and I'll add it to the list.